Welcome back to the evolution of Formula One, the ultimate pit stop for everything Formula One. Lewis Hamilton is the latest F1 megastar to sign for Ferrari. If this is news to you, then I'm sorry, but you can't call yourself an F1 fan. World media has been overrun with news and videos of Lewis Hamilton signing for Ferrari last year, and then recently testing Ferrari's new car for the 2025 Formula One season. However, as our channel is a Formula One history channel, we thought it might be fun to see what it might have been like if Hamilton drove for Ferrari in the 1950s when Ferrari were just starting out. So, imagine if you will, Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, master of the modern F1 car, zooming around circuits, but he's in a 1950s Ferrari. Enzo Ferrari has taken out his checkbook and signed Lewis Hamilton. It's a bit crazy, but let's break it down. How would Hamilton perform if he was plucked out of 2025 and transported back to the 1950s as a Ferrari F1 driver? The cars were wild, to say the least, like trying to tame Gunther Steiner after one of his Haas cars had crashed. Drivers had to wrestle the car around the track, keeping it on course with a blend of aggression, skill, and sheer luck at times. The cars had no fancy aerodynamics, no power steering, and definitely no comfy seats. I think Hamilton would have been complaining about his back before even attempting to drive any of them. The first Formula One car for Ferrari was the Ferrari 375, a 4.5-litre V12 engine of terror. These cars didn't produce huge horsepower like nowadays, but with steering wheels the size of sailing boats and handling that was like a shopping cart with square wheels, I think Hamilton's first call would have been to Angela Cullen, his conditioning coach, to build him some muscle. The Ferrari 500 F2 was reduced to a 2-litre inline-4 engine. It was the adapted car Ferrari used in 1952 and 1953 when Formula One rules changed to Formula 2 rules, and it was very successful with Alberto Ascari on board. Again, not huge horsepower, but if you compare Hamilton's physique to that of Ascari, I think Hamilton would have struggled to wrestle this beast of a car around a track for 2 hours, even with Ange by his side. The Ferrari D50 was a car produced by Lancia, which Ferrari used for Juan Manuel Fangio to secure the World Championship in 1956. Rules changed back to Formula One again in 1954, so Ferrari increased the engine to a 2.5-litre V8. Then came the Ferrari Dino 246, which Mike Hawthorn used to claim the World Championship in 1958. Ferrari used this car up to 1960. I think this car would have been most suited to Lewis Hamilton. The 246 was a 2.4-litre V6 engine with a lighter frame of 560 kilograms and a more active suspension. Hamilton's driving style today is precise and calculated. He takes smooth lines, calculates every move, and lets modern telemetry and sensors do a lot of the thinking. But in the 1950s, there was no smart car technology to back you up. There would have been no radio correspondence with Bono back then, that's for sure. His modern, light-touch approach might have got him into serious trouble in the 1950s. You could just see him asking his pit crew, "Why am I not getting any response from my brakes?" Overall, I think Hamilton may have struggled with the early cars up to 1955, but from 1956 onwards, the cars would have been more suited to his style of driving. The average number of races in an F1 season in the 1950s varied from 7 to 10 races, albeit the drivers raced in a lot of non-championship races also. Nowadays, Hamilton takes part in 24 races across the season. The average career of an F1 driver in the 1950s was about 3 to 5 years. Hamilton has been racing in F1 for 18 years, and he is still going. Already we can see reasons why Hamilton would have been a much more complete driver than that of a stereotypical 1950s F1 driver. Hamilton's main rival would of course have been 5-time world champion Juan Manuel Fangio. The maestro somehow made 1950s Formula One races look like he was cruising around on a Sunday drive. He had a win ratio of 47% in his Formula One career, which is a record that still stands today. Fangio was known for his smoothness, but it was a different kind of smoothness. He knew how to wrestle those machines into submission without looking like he was about to go into cardiac arrest like some other drivers. Nowadays, we don't get to see the body movements of the drivers as they are fully enclosed within the car. All we see are the driver's hands using the buttons and paddles on the steering wheel from the onboard cameras. Been interesting to see Hamilton's style of driving back then, leaning out of the car with his face covered in oil and fumes trying to manually change gear in his 4-speed gearbox. But I think in terms of driving ability, Hamilton would have been more than capable of beating Fangio. He is no stranger to overcoming adversity, and his determination and race IQ are second to none. A lot of times in the 1950s, it came down to car reliability, or lack of, should I say. Toto Wolff would have smashed more headphones in the 1950s than Fangio and Hamilton won races, if you know what I mean. Towards the end of the 1950s, British drivers were heavily involved in the title-deciding races, and it would have been amazing to see Hamilton racing the likes of Mike Hawthorn and Stirling Moss. Would Hawthorn have made friends with Hamilton the way he did with Peter Collins, or would Hawthorn have been Hamilton's Nico Rosberg equivalent? Hawthorn and Rosberg both retired after winning the World Championship, so they did have that in common. Hamilton for sure would never have stood for the safety culture of 1950s Formula One. 3 Ferrari drivers lost their lives in Grand Prix during the 1950s, and Alberto Ascari lost his life during a routine test run at a Ferrari event. Imagine Hamilton landing his car into the sea like Ascari did at the Monaco Grand Prix. Crashes were so bad sometimes in the 1950s that drivers were often thrown out of the car. Stirling Moss once remarked, "Better to be thrown out than burnt." That sums up the safety ethos in 1950s F1. Even in the modern era where safety standards are so high, accidents do happen. We all saw the halo save Hamilton's life at Monza in 2021 when Max Verstappen landed his car on top of him. The racing safety equipment at the beginning of the 1950s was more or less non-existent. A leather helmet, goggles and gloves wouldn't protect you on a trampoline, never mind racing a Formula One car around a racetrack. The image of Hamilton in this racing attire does amuse me though. In fact, he has probably turned up at a Grand Prix wearing something similar as casual wear over the years. But all jokes aside, he would have continuously pushed for driver safety and no doubt improved the standards for all drivers through this decade, such is his professionalism and love of the sport. The average age of a Formula One driver in the 1950s was 39. So, after recently turning 40, Hamilton would have been considered in his prime. Let's be honest. The lifestyle of 1950s Formula One drivers and current drivers is chalk and cheese. I don't think there would have been many vegan drivers like Hamilton back in the day. Even his dog Roscoe is vegan now. The drivers in the 1950s often had big, strong physiques to enable them to handle the cars. I think their only workouts might have been lifting pints of beer. Mike Hawthorn and Peter Collins were classic examples of that. Hamilton with Ange by his side probably would have been laughed at. There is not much historical information about how much drivers were paid in the 1950s, but Stirling Moss once mentioned he received about £8,000 salary in 1960. Lewis Hamilton is due to earn about $60 million in 2025 with Ferrari. That should keep Roscoe in vegan nuts for another while. We all know Hamilton is no stranger to a flamboyant outfit on race day. He has appeared in more quirky outfits than Gunther has cursed on Drive to Survive. Mike Hawthorn received extra media attention because he used to wear a bow tie when racing. Just imagine the scrutiny Hamilton would have got in a bright jumpsuit scooting down to the pit lane. Hamilton is one of the best drivers in the world to ever compete in Formula One. I think no matter the circumstances or conditions, Lewis Hamilton would have succeeded in any decade of F1. But I think the 1950s might possibly have been the hardest decade to adjust to, given the amateur conditions and raw unpredictability of what racing in this decade used to bring. It may have taken him a bit of time to adjust, but ultimately, he would have figured out how to tame those wild machines and dominate the decade, battling all the best drivers along the way. In fairness to Hamilton, he did have a go at driving Fangio's old Mercedes W196 around Silverstone in 2020, and he acknowledged his admiration for the car and the respect he had for the drivers back in those days. There were no back complaints after his spin in the W196, but he wasn't racing around for 2 hours, so horses for courses and all that. So, there you have it, Lewis Hamilton in the 1950s Ferrari team. We hope you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you want to see more videos about the history of Formula One.